Isaiah was born in Jerusalem, the main city of Judah. From childhood, he was surrounded by priests, rulers, and merchants. He lived near the temple and listened to conversations about politics, religion, and the problems of the people. He learned to observe attentively what was happening around him. His family had ties to important circles, which allowed him to understand how power and authority worked. As he grew, Isaiah noticed the differences between what people said they believed and what they did. He saw the powerful taking advantage of the weak, leaders caring only for their own interests, and many fulfilling rituals without thinking about justice or respect for others. Isaiah formed a family and had children whose names carried special messages. However, it was not only his family life that prepared him. Everything he experienced led him to become someone who would soon have to speak before his people. How did this man become one of the most remembered prophets? What led him to risk everything for the words he had to deliver? And what was the end of his path? Isaiah, youth between power and inequality. Isaiah was born in Jerusalem, the main city of the Kingdom of Judah. From a young age, he lived near the temple and the leaders of his people. His family was related to influential circles, which allowed him to know both the priests and the rulers closely. Although not much is known about his childhood, Isaiah grew up listening to conversations about politics, religion, and the problems that affected the nation. The streets of Jerusalem were full of merchants, travelers, priests, and soldiers. The temple was the center of religious life, where sacrifices, prayers, and rituals that organized the days were performed. However, beneath that constant activity, inequalities, abuses, and tensions were hidden. The powerful took advantage of their position, while the weak were left unprotected. Many fulfilled the rites only out of habit, without really practicing justice or respect. Isaiah formed a family. His wife, mentioned as a prophetess in some accounts, shared with him a special sensitivity towards the spiritual. They had children whose names carried clear messages for the people. From a young age, Isaiah showed interest in important issues. He understood that the essential thing was not to comply with external rules, but to act with honesty and care towards others. Throughout his youth, Isaiah witnessed how the internal problems of the kingdom mixed with external threats. Judah lived under the shadow of powers such as Assyria. The decisions of the kings could bring security or cause catastrophes. The future prophet observed attentively, understanding that the stability of the people depended not only on armies or political alliances, but also on the righteousness of their leaders and their relationship with God. The social environment of Jerusalem was full of contrasts. On the one hand, the city kept its traditions alive with festivities, sacrifices, and prayers. On the other hand, corruption and inequality were increasingly evident. Isaiah, looking around him, perceived that there was a distance between what people said they believed and what they actually did. These early years were a silent preparation. Although he had not yet received the prophetic call, Isaiah developed a critical view of what was happening in his environment. His closeness to the temple and to the circles of power gave him a perspective that was not within everyone's reach. At that time, King Uzziah ruled Judah. During his reign, there were moments of progress, but also of mistakes and difficulties. Isaiah observed how the king's decisions could affect the entire nation. He knew that it was not enough to maintain appearances. The future of the people depended on true integrity, both in their leaders and in the community. Isaiah's youth was a time of deep learning. Without seeking prominence, he built within himself a firm conscience about what just leadership should be. He saw how the weak were abandoned, how religious norms were followed only outwardly, how the powerful acted for their own benefit. Each of these experiences shaped him. Isaiah grew up among a people who knew many promises, but who faced constant challenges. The land where he lived had a long history, full of moments of authentic faith, but also of painful falls. From a young age, Isaiah witnessed how people could stray, clinging to empty rituals while neglecting justice and mercy. This period shows an attentive young man, aware of his surroundings, close to power, but not trapped by it. Although he had not yet received the call that would transform him into a prophet, Isaiah was already silently building the foundation of what was to come. Each experience, each observation, each moment lived in Jerusalem left a mark on his life, preparing his voice to later become a tool of warning and hope for the people. The calling in the temple. Isaiah was in the temple, the central place of religious life in Jerusalem. That space was known for the prayers, sacrifices, and rituals that marked the days of the people. But what happened there was not a common ceremony. That day, Isaiah had a unique experience, something that transformed him forever. It was the year that King Uzziah had died, and the atmosphere in Judah was one of tension and uncertainty. The power vacuum, foreign threats, and internal worries weighed on the city. Isaiah, who until then had observed and reflected, was surprised by an unexpected vision within the sanctuary. Before him, an impressive image opened up. The Lord was seated high above, on a throne that surpassed any earthly power. Around him were celestial beings called seraphim, who proclaimed the holiness of God. Their voices were so powerful that they made the thresholds of the temple tremble, and the place was filled with smoke. Isaiah felt fear. He knew that no human being could be in the direct presence of God without recognizing their own smallness and fragility. At that moment, one of the seraphim approached Isaiah carrying a burning coal taken from the altar. He touched his lips and announced that his sins had been forgiven. This gesture was not a simple symbolic act. It represented the beginning of a new stage for Isaiah. He was prepared to fulfill a difficult task. Then he heard a voice asking, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Isaiah, without hesitation, replied, "Here I am, send me." With those words, the man who until then had been only an observer became a messenger. The task he received was not easy. He had to speak to a people who, for the most part, would not listen to him. His words would not be received with enthusiasm because they would expose the flaws, injustices, and inconsistencies of their society. God warned him that many would have deaf ears and closed eyes, but even so, he had to fulfill his mission. Isaiah accepted firmly. He knew that his task did not depend on the reaction of others, but on his own faithfulness to the message received. From that day on, Isaiah began to walk through Jerusalem with a different perspective. Now he understood that every warning he uttered, every message he delivered, carried the weight of that encounter in the temple. He did not speak for himself, but as a spokesperson for something greater. The prophet did not seek popularity or approval. His role was to be faithful to the task he had received, even if it meant being rejected or misunderstood. Isaiah understood that his message should reach both leaders and the common people. His voice should resonate in palaces, in the streets, in the temple, and in any place where injustice, corruption, and hypocrisy were present. He knew that every word counted, and that the time to act was not infinite. The vision not only gave him a task, it also showed him that the holiness of God was above any human power. The Lord, whom Isaiah had seen, was not a simple endorsement for the political decisions of the moment. He was an authority that demanded justice and righteousness without negotiations or half-hearted agreements. The prophet began his mission with a purified heart, but also aware of the risks. He knew that uncomfortable truths could generate animosities. He knew that speaking in the name of God did not make him untouchable. Even so, he chose to walk that path, trusting that fulfilling his task was more important than avoiding dangers. From then on, Isaiah was known not only as a man of his word, but as someone willing to go all the way with his assignment. Each passing day presented him with new challenges. Each encounter was an opportunity to repeat what he had heard in that sacred moment. The need for real change, for a sincere return to the essential. The call in the temple was the beginning of a stage that would test his character, his courage, and his faith. Isaiah understood that, although not everyone would listen to him, his duty was to speak, and that he did with conviction, step by step, carrying a message that went beyond his own voice. First steps of the prophet, children's signs and early warnings. After the calling in the temple, Isaiah began to receive specific signs that he had to share with his people. It was not enough to speak in general terms. Now he had to present clear, visible signs that marked the concrete beginning of his mission. Among the most striking elements was the name he gave his children, because each one had a meaning related to the messages he had to convey. The first son was called Seir Yashub, which means a remnant shall return. That name was not chosen at random. It represented the idea that, although Judah faced calamities, there would always be a small group, a faithful remnant, that would return and survive. Isaiah knew that his task was not only to announce misfortunes, but also to remember that there would be hope for those who maintained their trust in the Lord. Shortly after, his second son was born. Maher-shalal-hash-baz, whose name means speedy plunder, quick prey. This direct message warned that the enemies, particularly Damascus and Samaria, would be quickly defeated. Isaiah understood that these names were not simple personal decisions, but tools to speak to the community. Every time someone called his children, they heard a constant reminder of the divine warnings and the consequences that would come if they did not change their attitude. In the midst of these family signs, Isaiah began to deliver his first public warnings. He did not limit himself to criticizing general faults, but pointed out the specific problems that threatened Jerusalem. Corruption in high positions, growing inequality, religious hypocrisy, and dangerous political alliances. His language was direct and blunt. He did not seek to soften his words to please, but to faithfully fulfill the mission he had been given. One of the most significant episodes in these early steps was the moment when Isaiah appeared before King Ahaz. The prophet offered the monarch the possibility of asking for a sign from the Lord to confirm his help. However, Ahaz refused, claiming that he did not want to put God to the test. Isaiah, far from leaving the matter there, then announced the sign of Emmanuel, the child who would be born as a symbol of the divine presence among his people. This message had enormous weight. It showed that, even in the face of the disbelief of the leaders, God kept his promise to accompany Judah active. Isaiah did not act only from his home, nor did he limit himself to words. He began to perform symbolic acts in public to reinforce his warnings. On one occasion, he walked barefoot and dressed as a prisoner of war for 3 years, to show the people what would happen to them if they continued to trust in unstable political alliances, especially with Egypt and Cush. His very life became a living sign, a concrete demonstration that the words he conveyed were not simple opinions, but urgent warnings. The impact of these early actions was not immediate. Many looked at him with suspicion, others considered him too harsh. However, Isaiah did not seek approval. He knew that his task was to warn, even if that placed him in an uncomfortable position before the community and the authorities. Each gesture, each word, each symbolic action had only one purpose: to open the eyes of those who could still react in time. These first steps consolidated Isaiah as a recognized figure, but also a feared one. He was not just a prophet who spoke of theories. He used the resources of his family life, the names of his children, visible signs and public acts to reinforce a clear message. The people had to stop trusting in appearances and return to an authentic relationship with the Lord. Otherwise, judgment would be inevitable. Throughout this time, Isaiah understood that his path would not be easy. The resistance of the people, the rejection of the leaders, and the harshness of the messages he had to deliver would accompany him throughout his life. However, he did not stop. Each sign he transmitted, each warning he uttered, was part of a greater calling that he could not abandon. Thus he began, step by step, to build the mission that would make him one of the most influential prophets of his time. Facing Ahaz, Isaiah faced one of the most tense moments of his prophetic career during the reign of King Ahaz. It was a time of crisis for Judah. The threats from Damascus and Samaria became more aggressive, and rumors of war filled the streets of Jerusalem. The nervous king sought desperate alliances, even with foreign powers like Assyria, to protect his throne. The prophet, firm in his mission, approached Ahaz with a clear message. He offered him the possibility of asking for a sign from the Lord, a gesture that would confirm that it was not necessary to depend on human alliances for protection. However, the monarch, fearful or perhaps distrustful, refused to ask for that sign. Isaiah did not back down. He announced to him the sign of Emmanuel anyway, a child whose name meant that God was with his people. This announcement was more than a simple prophecy. It was a direct reminder that security should not be sought in political pacts, but in fidelity to the Lord. Meanwhile, Ahaz continued to consider alliances. He feared the combined strength of Damascus and Samaria and decided to send messages to the king of Assyria, declaring himself his vassal. To seal this agreement, he even sent the treasures of the temple and the palace as tribute. Isaiah, who observed these movements, knew that these decisions would have consequences. He well knew the dangerous game of depending on foreign powers and warned that this misplaced trust could bring more harm than good. The prophet did not only convey words, his very presence was a constant reminder of what was at stake. Every time he spoke before the king, every time he crossed the palace courtyards, he represented a stance of resistance against the temptation to seek quick and easy solutions. Isaiah knew that true salvation would not come from external armies, but from returning to the right path, from repairing the broken relationship between the people and their God. The days passed, and Ahaz's decisions continued to accumulate. The king took measures that even changed religious aspects, adapting altars and practices to align with foreign customs. Isaiah saw how the heart of the people moved further and further away from the essential, and his messages became more urgent. However, his role was not to impose, but to warn. Amid these tensions, Isaiah did not stop speaking. He did not seek the favor of the king or his advisors. He knew that many looked at him with suspicion, that his words were uncomfortable, that his warnings sounded harsh. Even so, the prophet continued, convinced that he had to fulfill his task. The figure of Isaiah in those years was consolidated as a firm voice in the midst of the political storm. While alliances were secretly forged and decisions were made under pressure, the prophet continued to remind everyone that true strength was not in treaties or armies, but in fidelity and justice. The story between Isaiah and Ahaz was a clear example of how difficult it was to be the bearer of an uncomfortable message. The prophet did not seek to overthrow the king or take his place, but neither could he remain silent while he saw how hasty decisions led the people towards an abyss. With every word, Isaiah confirmed his commitment to the mission he had received, even knowing that his warnings might fall on deaf ears. The kingdom of Judah in those years lived under the shadow of fear. Foreign powers, enemy armies, internal tensions, everything seemed to push towards a situation of collapse. In the midst of that scenario, Isaiah remained firm, convinced that the only real way out was to abandon empty human solutions and return to trusting in something greater than political treaties. Time of Hezekiah, resistance against Assyria and oracles of war. When Hezekiah ascended the throne of Judah, Isaiah was already a well-known figure. However, under this new king, the prophet's role acquired even greater weight. Political tensions reached dangerous levels. Assyria had become the dominant power in the region, and many of the neighboring kingdoms, driven by pro-Egyptian sympathies, dreamed of rebelling. Isaiah, with his experience and vision, knew that these movements were risky. In the early years of Hezekiah's reign, the prophet maintained his message of caution. He did not encourage alliances with foreign powers or open rebellions. Isaiah considered that the only real basis for security was to trust in the Lord, not in the promises of human armies. Meanwhile, tensions grew. The uprisings of the Philistine cities between 713 and 711 before Christ were a clear example. Isaiah, as a sign, walked barefoot and half-naked for 3 years, showing the people what would happen to them if they trusted in Egypt and Cush to confront Assyria. The climax came when Sennacherib, successor to Sargon II, launched his offensive. The Assyrian army advanced with speed and brutality, subduing entire regions. Jerusalem was directly threatened. The Assyrians not only imposed military power, but also a system of psychological humiliation. In the letters sent to Hezekiah, the Assyrian king mocked the Lord's ability to save Judah, comparing him to the defeated gods of other peoples. These letters, read in public, were designed to demoralize both the soldiers and the inhabitants. At that moment, Isaiah remained faithful to his message. Do not panic, do not seek last-minute alliances, do not give in. The prophet advised the king to remain calm, to hold fast to faith, and to trust that the Lord would defend his city. Isaiah and Hezekiah shared moments of intense prayer in the temple. The texts describe how the king spread the Assyrian letters before the altar, asking the Lord to respond not only for Jerusalem, but for the honor of his name before the nations. The siege was intense. The Assyrian envoys, led by the Rabshakeh, intimidated with military threats and offensive words, speaking in Hebrew so that all the inhabitants could understand. Isaiah, together with the king's messengers, listened to these provocations and knew that they were directed not only against the city, but against the very God of Israel. Hezekiah, distressed, asked the prophet to intercede for the people and waited for a response. Isaiah brought a clear message. The Assyrians would not triumph. The Lord would act in favor of his people, not because of their merits, but to defend his own name. According to ancient records, during the night, a disaster struck the Assyrian army. The enemy withdrew abruptly, and Jerusalem was saved. Isaiah knew that this salvation did not mean that everything was resolved forever. It was a call to remain faithful, not to be carried away by false securities or to repeat past mistakes. Throughout this stage, Isaiah also delivered oracles of war, harsh messages that warned of the consequences of trusting too much in human politics. He criticized the arrogance of leaders who sought their own glory and constantly reminded everyone that justice should prevail over strategic calculations. Each discourse reinforced his position. The only real security came from the Lord. The prophet's role during Hezekiah's reign was not easy. Although the king was seen as pious and willing to listen, the political pressures were enormous. Isaiah had to move carefully, balancing his message with the harsh reality of a small kingdom surrounded by giants. He knew that the history of Judah depended on concrete decisions, and that although words might seem insufficient against armed armies, fidelity was the only real shield the people had. The memory of these years remained etched in the people's minds. Isaiah was not just a spiritual advisor. He was a guide in the midst of a political and military crisis that could have ended Judah's very existence. His figure became associated with resistance, not through weapons, but through deep trust in the divine plan. Jerusalem survived, not because it had the strength of other empires, but because there were still voices like that of Isaiah who dared to remember what was essential. The great prophecies, judgment, fall of Jerusalem, and messages of punishment. Isaiah became a prophet marked by a double message, one of severe warning and another of hope, but only for those who were willing to change. His voice resonated through the streets, squares, and corners of the kingdom, alerting about the inevitable consequences of corruption, injustice, and lack of fidelity. He did not speak from personal anger or political ambition. He spoke because he had been called to do so. From the early chapters of his announcement, Isaiah did not hide his concern for Jerusalem. He observed how the city, which should have been a symbol of justice, was transformed into a place marked by selfishness and contempt for the weak. He called the leaders rulers of Sodom and the inhabitants people of Gomorrah, recalling that the sin of those ancient cities was not only moral but also social, for ignoring the suffering of their neighbors. Isaiah conveyed that the Lord, like a disappointed father, had the right to expect loyalty and fidelity from his people. However, instead of obedience, he found rebellion. Therefore, the announced punishments were not whims, but responses to a long history of disobedience. It would not be a total punishment. There would always remain a remnant, a small group that would survive and keep the relationship with God alive. The image Isaiah used was strong. He said that Jerusalem was like a vineyard carefully planted and cared for, but that instead of good grapes, it only produced bitter fruit. This picture showed the Lord's deep disappointment. The leaders and the social elite were accused of arrogance, of lifting their heads with pride while the people suffered. Isaiah was not afraid to confront them, and his aristocratic lineage gave him access to the corridors of power, where he launched his warnings without reservation. Isaiah did not only speak to his time. The words of judgment and the threats of fall were also directed to future generations. He announced that Jerusalem, if it did not change, would face looting, destruction, and exile. The comparison with Sodom and Gomorrah was not just a metaphor. It was a reminder that even the most blessed places could be overthrown if they did not correct their path. The prophet insisted that ceremonies and sacrifices were useless if they were not accompanied by justice. No ritual could replace respect for the poor, the widow, and the orphan. Isaiah denounced an empty religion, a faith that only sought appearances and did not transform the heart. Despite the harshness of his messages, Isaiah never lost sight of the possibility of redemption. He spoke of a future where, after punishment, the people would return transformed. The promise that a shoot would spring from the root of Jesse showed that, although the tree was cut down, it was not condemned forever. The prophet taught that judgment was not the end, but a necessary step to open a path of renewal. In this period, Isaiah also directed oracles not only to Judah, but to the neighboring nations. He knew that the behavior of the great empires, such as Assyria and Babylon, would have repercussions on his own people. He warned that the pride of those powers would not go unanswered. In this sense, his message transcended the borders of Jerusalem, reminding everyone that the Lord's justice encompassed all nations. The messages of punishment did not seek to crush the listener, but to shake them. Isaiah understood that harsh words were necessary because the people had become deaf to gentle calls. Each announcement of judgment was accompanied by a reminder. Those who sincerely turned to the Lord would be part of the remnant that would keep hope alive. In these years, Isaiah made it clear that the problem was not only external, of armies or foreign threats, but internal, of hardened hearts and ignored justice. His voice rose to remind everyone that without a real transformation, no wall, no alliance, and no ritual could save Jerusalem from what was coming. The prophecies of restoration, future hope and message to the generations. After announcing harsh judgments, Isaiah was also the bearer of words of comfort. His message did not remain trapped in denunciation. He looked ahead towards a time of restoration and hope. The prophet spoke of a future where Jerusalem would not be a symbol of ruin, but of renewal. He did not do so as a naive dreamer, but as someone who trusted that the Lord would fulfill his promises, even after punishment. One of the most powerful elements in his words was the image of the shoot that would spring from the trunk of Jesse, the family of David. Although the tree had been felled, a stump remained from which life would sprout. This shoot represented a future leader, filled with the spirit of wisdom and justice, capable of establishing a reign of true peace. Under his rule, enemies would cease to confront each other, animals would live in harmony, and the earth would be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. Isaiah did not only speak to the present, his voice crossed generations. The prophet offered words that would touch not only his contemporaries, but also those who would live after the exile, when Judah would again raise its walls and rebuild its temple. The promise was clear: not everything would end in defeat. After suffering would come healing. The figure of the servant of the Lord appears as one of the most moving images in the writings of Isaiah. This servant, presented not as a powerful warrior, but as someone who bears the sufferings of others, would be exalted by God. Through his pain, many would be healed. Isaiah did not describe him as a common hero, but as someone who, although rejected and mistreated, would have a central role in the restoration of the people. This message taught that greatness is not always shown in visible power, but in surrender and sacrifice. The prophet also spoke of a future in which Jerusalem would be a meeting place for all nations. Not only Israelites, but peoples from all corners of the earth would come to seek instruction and justice. Weapons would be transformed into tools of work, and war would give way to peace. Isaiah held a vision of universal reconciliation, where praise to the Lord would fill the earth without borders. These messages did not arise in an easy moment. Isaiah pronounced them in the midst of external threats, internal political crises, and doubts about the future. However, he insisted that God had not forgotten his people. The words of comfort, the songs of hope, and the promises of renewal were reminders that history did not end with destruction. The book collects hymns of victory and joy, calls to the people to recognize that their liberation was assured not by their own strength, but by the constant love of the Lord. Isaiah asked them to look beyond their immediate situation and trust in a better future. The faithful servants would be distinguished from the adversaries, and the New Jerusalem would be a place where justice and peace reigned. In the prophet's visions, powerful images appeared: the wolf and the lamb grazing together, the lion eating straw like the ox, the child playing near the viper's den without fear. All of this showed that, under the rule of the shoot, the world itself would be transformed, and relationships marked by fear and violence would give way to harmony. Isaiah did not ignore the wounds of the past. He recognized sin, guilt, and pain, but he did not remain trapped in them. He announced a new path, where the people would learn from their mistakes and walk towards a renewed relationship with the Lord. The central message was that hope was possible, not because the people deserved it, but because God had decided to act in favor of those who sincerely sought him. Furthermore, Isaiah presented the idea of a new heaven and a new earth, where joy would replace weeping and justice would flourish permanently. He invited everyone to imagine a restored Jerusalem, full of life, where the sound of lament would never again be heard nor unjust pain be seen. The prophet's words reinforced that not only would external circumstances change, but also the hearts of those who embraced fidelity. Thus, Isaiah's prophecies of restoration became a beacon for entire generations. They reminded everyone that even in the darkest moments, there was still room for light. And that fidelity, although sometimes silent, would always have its reward. symbolic acts, public gestures, and difficult messages. Isaiah not only spoke, he also acted. His messages were not limited to words, but were expressed in visible gestures that impacted those around him. One of the most striking actions occurred during the Philistine uprisings, when, for 3 years, he walked barefoot and dressed as a prisoner of war. This act, far from being a simple eccentricity, was a warning sign. It showed what would happen to Judah if it continued to trust in dangerous alliances with Egypt and Cush, believing that those foreign powers could save it from Assyria. This public gesture provoked surprise, discomfort, and rejection. Isaiah, a man from a recognized family, did not need to expose himself in that way. However, he did so because he was convinced that words alone were no longer enough. The people had become insensitive, accustomed to hearing warnings without reacting. It was necessary to show in his own flesh the reality that was coming. Isaiah understood that these gestures were an extension of his mission. He did not seek to draw attention to himself, but to shake consciences. When he walked barefoot, when he appeared in humble attire, he was representing the future that awaited those who did not correct their course. Each step he took was a silent denunciation, a way of speaking without uttering a word. In addition to these acts, the prophet used the names of his children as living signs. The names, full of meaning, became constant reminders of divine announcements. Isaiah did not separate his personal life from his mission. Every aspect of his existence was aligned with the message he had to convey. The challenge was not only external. Isaiah also faced internal resistance, especially from religious and political leaders who saw his actions as threats. He harshly criticized the corrupt aristocracy of the temple, recalling that true fidelity was not shown in empty rituals, but in a life of justice. This confrontation with the figures of power made him an uncomfortable person, even for those who formerly shared his faith. Isaiah knew that every gesture had a price. Being a spokesperson for harsh messages socially isolated him, exposed him to mockery, and placed him at the center of tensions. However, he never stopped. His commitment did not depend on the acceptance of others, but on faithfulness to his calling. Amid the political tension, when foreign powers reorganized and small kingdoms sought survival strategies, Isaiah maintained his position. He did not advise useless rebellions or dangerous dependencies. He asked for fidelity, justice, righteousness, and when his words were not enough, he showed it with his own life. These symbolic gestures were not just isolated signs. They were part of a broader strategy to awaken a slumbering people. Isaiah understood that the message should reach not only the intellect, but also the emotions and the heart. That is why he walked barefoot, why he named his children prophetically, why he publicly denounced the flaws of his society. The figure of Isaiah in these years became a mixture of prophet, messenger, and living symbol. His life was not separate from his message. Everything in him spoke, even when he was silent. The challenge was enormous, but Isaiah accepted each difficulty with the conviction that he had to fulfill the task that had been entrusted to him. The uncomfortable figure, conflicts with leaders and reactions of the people. Isaiah did not go unnoticed in his society. From the beginning, his direct messages and his warnings ignited tensions between him and the figures of power. Political and religious leaders looked at him with distrust. He criticized corruption, denounced the arrogance of rulers, and pointed out unjust practices with a clarity that made many uncomfortable. Unlike other prophets who acted from rural margins, Isaiah belonged to an aristocratic family. That gave him access to circles close to the throne and the temple. This privilege, however, did not save him from being seen as a threat. The criticisms he directed at the elites were strong. He called Jerusalem rulers of Sodom and inhabitants of Gomorrah, using powerful images that made clear the level of moral decay he denounced. The people, for their part, reacted with a mixture of fear and rejection. Many saw him as an exaggerated messenger, someone who spoke of distant punishments while everyday life went on. Religious leaders concerned with maintaining order considered him a dangerous voice that could destabilize social peace. Isaiah did not soften his words. He denounced not only the powerful, but also the common citizens who participated in injustices or looked the other way. In the temple courtyards, his presence was uncomfortable. He did not limit himself to criticizing external ceremonies, but recalled that without a real change in attitudes, sacrifices were worthless. His words struck at the heart of religious practice. What good was it to offer animals if the poor were despised? What was the point of so much ritual if the needy were ignored? Isaiah insisted that the relationship with the Lord should be expressed in just actions, not just symbolic gestures. Isaiah also clashed with other prophets and counselors of the king. Some presented themselves as bearers of peaceful messages, assuring that everything would be fine. Isaiah, on the other hand, did not offer soft words. He spoke of judgment, of correction, of the need to face the consequences of wrong decisions. This made him a divisive figure. A few admired him for his courage, while many rejected him for his harshness. Despite the opposition, Isaiah did not stop. He knew that being a prophet did not mean pleasing everyone. His task was to deliver the message that had been entrusted to him, even if it meant losing friends, breaking social alliances, or becoming isolated. The tensions reached such a point that, even among his contemporaries, rumors began to circulate about his true intentions. Some accused him of wanting to provoke unnecessary fear, others looked at him as an agitator. The prophet's response was to continue. He did not seek to please either the rulers or the common people. His commitment was to the mission he had received, and that kept him firm even when the criticisms intensified. Isaiah understood that the truth was uncomfortable, but he also knew that without facing that discomfort, there would be no possibility of change. Throughout these years, Isaiah established himself as a key figure, but always surrounded by controversy. It was difficult to find someone who did not have an opinion about him. For some, he was a courageous guide, for others an annoying reminder of what they did not want to hear. The prophet walked through Jerusalem, knowing that every word spoken could bring him closer to misunderstanding and rejection, but he continued, convinced that he had to fulfill his assignment to the last consequences. The martyrdom under Manasseh, tradition of the brutal end, and extra-canonical versions. At the end of his life, Isaiah lived the most difficult years of his mission. After the death of Hezekiah, the throne of Judah passed to Manasseh, one of the most problematic kings in the history of the kingdom. This new monarch, far from continuing his father's reforms, adopted practices that Isaiah had denounced for years. Under his rule, pagan altars, foreign customs, and actions that the prophet had warned would bring consequences multiplied. Isaiah, already elderly, did not remain silent. Although the circumstances were dangerous, he continued to denounce injustices and point out the errors of leadership. The political climate, however, had hardened. Manasseh did not show the willingness to listen that Hezekiah had had. The prophet, who had been a respected voice in earlier times, now became an uncomfortable enemy for the court. The biblical records do not narrate the details of his death, but the extra-canonical traditions, especially the text known as the Vitae Prophetarum, preserve a shocking account. According to these ancient sources, Isaiah was persecuted by order of Manasseh. The main reason would have been his constant denunciation of idolatrous practices, something that the king was not willing to tolerate. Tradition indicates that the prophet hid in a tree to escape those who were looking for him. When he was discovered, the soldiers took him from his hiding place and carried out a brutal order. Isaiah was sawn in two. This form of execution, described with sobriety in the ancient accounts, was recorded as one of the cruelest martyrdoms suffered by a prophet in the history of Judah. Rabbinic sources, such as some passages from the Talmud and medieval Jewish commentaries, also mention this fate. They relate that Isaiah was condemned for declaring words that defied the king and for maintaining a stance of exclusive obedience to God, without submitting to human authorities when these contradicted the fundamental principles of faith. These accounts, although varied in minor details, coincide in showing Isaiah as a prophet whose fidelity led him to face the most extreme rejection. There are no detailed records of what happened immediately after his death, or about the fate of his disciples or closest followers. What is clear is that Isaiah died faithful to the mission he had assumed since his youth. He never abandoned his role, never softened his messages, never yielded to the pressures of the powerful. His figure, although physically eliminated, remained alive in the stories that circulated in subsequent generations. The impact of his life, his words and his acts, did not disappear with his death. The texts that mention him, The traditions that preserved his history and the records that transmitted his prophecies recorded a man who, until the last moment, was consistent with the calling he had received. The memory of Isaiah was fixed not only in the scriptures, but also in the cultural tradition of his people. He was remembered as a model of integrity, as someone who was neither bought nor intimidated. His tragic fate became a symbol of the cost that maintaining fidelity to a spiritual mission can have, even in the face of rejection from those who occupy the thrones of the earth. Thus ended the life of Isaiah, the man who from Jerusalem spoke to his people, defied kings, delivered difficult messages, and finally faced a cruel end for remaining faithful to what he believed. Isaiah concluded his story, leaving behind a path full of clear events, firm decisions, and visible consequences. He was a man who spoke when others remained silent, who acted when many chose not to take risks, and who upheld his message even when everything seemed to turn against him. His passage through history was not limited to the years he lived, because his words and actions remained as a reference for those who came after. Subsequent generations found him in texts, in traditions, in teachings that crossed borders and centuries, not as a decorated hero, but as an example of coherence in the face of difficult circumstances. The memory of Isaiah serves as a sign of what it means to remain faithful to a task, even when there are no applause or immediate rewards. His figure shows that courage is not only in uttering messages, but in living them to the last consequences. Isaiah did not seek to have everyone follow him or understand him, but he did not abandon what he considered his responsibility. His story exposed that firmness does not arise from the desire to impose, but from the decision to fulfill what is considered right, even when it implies losing everything. In closing this journey, the open question is not only about the fate of one man, but about what his story represents. What does Isaiah teach about the cost of sustaining a mission in the face of pressure, rejection, and misunderstanding? And why does his memory remain alive, as a reminder of what it means to fulfill a task without deviating or stopping until the last moment? What makes a legacy remain intact over time when its roots are built on facts, not on empty words?